The chandeliers dripped soft light over polished mahogany, the clink of crystal cutlery punctuating conversations that sounded like carefully rehearsed lines. Heat rose from plates and from bodies pressed into velvet booths, and somewhere in the kitchen, the sharp scent of lemon cut through the smoke of braised meat. Maya smoothed her apron with fingers that remembered tremors, not from stage fright, but from the muscle memory of staying small. She had learned to move through rooms like a shadow, to fold herself around the needs of strangers so no one watched the seams of her life. Tonight, the air tasted of citrus and tension, and on the table nearest the entrance, a woman with silver hair laughed with a voice that had lived long enough to be both brittle and kind. "Table 9 will need another bottle," Carla said without looking up from the reservation book. Carla had run the floor for years and carried a patience that was part thrift and part calculation. Maya lifted a bottle that cost more than her monthly rent and smiled into the practiced mask she kept in the front pocket of her uniform. At the far table, a man sat like a question mark turned authoritative, his suit the exact shade of intimidation. Vincent Moretti. The name moved through the room like a temperature change. He came with a presence that made nearby conversations tilt toward silence. "Your wine, sir," Maya said, careful. He did not take the bottle. Instead, he pointed with a fingertip toward the woman of his side, an almost invisible gesture that said everything without being loud. "My mother." Maya felt the old reflex find her hands before her voice engaged. She began to sign, a language she had folded into herself like a second heartbeat. The silver-haired woman caught the signs like a mirror catching light, and her face softened into something that was not scripted for the room. Vincent watched with a slow closing of his eyes, as if some small private alarm had been triggered. The exchange lasted seconds for everyone else and an eternity for Maya. The woman smiled and responded, the two trading small anecdotes in gestures that smelled of homemade bread and sea air. To the other diners, it was a quaint moment. To Vincent, it was a crack in a map he thought finished. He leaned in, voice low and even, and asked a question that did not allow the protection of anonymity. "Where did you learn to sign?" Maya froze in the motion that had always come easily to her. Her reply came soft and automatic, "With a cousin." His gaze tightened, as if examining a file for a missing line. The rest of the room kept its choreography. For Maya, the map of her nights, of the way she erased her past, began to blur. A few minutes later, after serving and stepping into the blur of the kitchen, Maya felt the thread of a life she had tried to keep thin begin to thicken. Elena, a regular who worked nights at the clinic, knocked lightly on the kitchen door and said, "Did you see? Rosa lit up when you signed." Elena had a voice like a worn bell, and hands that always smelled of vegetable oil from late shifts. Across the room, Marco, the line cook, laughed and tossed a towel. Tony, the bouncer, leaned back against a freezer, chewing on something sweet and watching. Names braided around Maya like a net. This small scene was a quiet test of how visible she allowed herself to be. It was also the first time someone at the restaurant had connected her past to the polished men who paid without flinching. The next night, the same table appeared, but the air carried a different undertone. Vincent arrived with fewer people, his steps measured, and the scent of his cologne folding into the wood smoke. His mother wore a coral scarf and the patience of someone who knew to measure a man's fear with the weight of her silence. Maya approached with a tray, and, before she thought, placed a hand near Rosa to steady a glass that trembled. The touch was reflexive and brief, but enough to make heads pivot. Vincent named people with an economy that cut through small talk. "Sophia, check the lights. Carla, ensure privacy for my table." Each command arranged the room like pieces on a board. When Maya returned with a dessert plate, Rosa reached for her hand and signed a small sentence of gratitude that neither spoke aloud. Vincent watched as though the hands were revealing a text he had not authorized. At 33% into the evening, a cut of silence made space for the audience to decide whether to lean in or look away. This is the moment to ask the viewer a question and invite their voice. If you were the protagonist in this room, what would you do when the person with the most to lose noticed something only you could hide? Type in the comments one of these choices and tell us why you chose it. Start with, I would run, I would confront, or I would find help. Your answers shape how people understand risk and courage. That same pause held the next motion. Vincent spoke, his words precise enough to be surgical. You know the sign for grandmother, he said, a surface statement with an undertow. Maya smiled in the place where survival softened into lie. Behind Vincent, a man named Luca, who drove for them on laundry days, tapped messages into a small phone. A young woman named Sophia, a volunteer with a neighborhood shelter, watched with folded hands. Detective Ramirez, who sometimes ate alone at the bar, noticed nothing then, but later would piece together patterns like stitches. For Maya, the question was no longer rhetorical. The presence of a powerful listener changed the meaning of every small act. The next block of nights became a study in being watched. Someone photographed the terrace. A car loitered at the curb with its engine too warm for coincidental parking. Carla mentioned, offhand, that someone had called asking which nights Maya worked. They said they were a relative, she told Marco and Tony in a whisper that made the kitchen sound like a confessional. Maya began to notice the hum of things she had thought were distant. She moved with greater intention. Her hands knew sign language like a song, but now each gesture carried risk. She started writing small notes to herself and stashing them beneath a loose floorboard. She found a folded receipt in her locker from a clinic that no longer existed, a remnant of a life she had left without ceremonies. The intimacy between her and Rosa at the table had shown something small and human. Vincent had noticed the wrong small thing in the wrong way. When the first overt confrontation came, it did not feel cinematic. It felt administrative. Vincent approached Maya after service and asked to speak in the alley, where the air smelled of cold metal and fried oil and the city exhaled damp breath. The dialogue stretched long and tight like a wire. You have a way with people, he said. You have a way of being alone in a room. Maya answered with careful neutrality. I am just doing my job. Of course, he said, but you are not just a server. Her heart thudded, but her words were steady. I keep to myself. Do you have family nearby? He asked. No, she said, not here. Where did you learn to sign? He asked again, indicating that the question had outlived the table. The conversation that followed included exchanges that folded accusation, curiosity, and a strange, reluctant respect. The back and forth between them became 8 rounds of thin inquiry and small avowal, each reply revealing slivers of truth without offering any safety net. In the end, he offered a conditional kindness, one that smelled of trade. Keep your head down, he said, and if anyone asks about a woman named Rosa, say nothing. The instruction occupied the space between a favor and a threat. Maya listened, and the promise of the evening seemed to condense into a ledger. She went home with the taste of espresso on her tongue and a plan not fully formed. The days after were full of surveillance by way of casuality. A man at the bar wrote down her schedule. Elena texted that a woman from a community program had seen Rosa in a neighborhood 2 miles from the restaurant. Little by little, the threads knotted into a rope. Maya began thinking in contingencies. She rehearsed what she might say to a detective. She called Sophia and asked for a place to stay, testing loyalties. Sophia answered with a practical warmth. You can come for as long as you need, she said. We are small, but loud for the right reasons. The backstory, that had been mostly private, came forward in a slow, necessary bloom. Maya had grown up in a coastal town where her mother sold oranges on a square that smelled of salt and sun. As a child, she learned sign language, the way other children learn lullabies, not because of formal classes, but because her cousin Luca was deaf and quick to teach her the songs of hands and face. When she was 16, an argument about debts and pride had splintered the family. Her father left for a job that promised stability and found something else instead. Her mother took as much as she could carry and left after nights too long and cold to sit through. Maya left with a duffel and a train ticket and a muffled apology she kept to herself. She arrived in the city with a small scholarship, uncertain hours, and a faith in her own ability to disappear. The years that followed taught her to trade visibility for safety. She had worked toward an apron and a rhythm and avoided questions about where she had come from. The memory of the square, of the way hands moved like boats, kept her anchored. But it also connected her to a network of old names that, when spoken now, made the air around Vincent feel more dangerous than it had the night before. The revelation that the mother at table 9 might be tied to people she once knew shifted the stakes from personal privacy to actual threat. A man named Carlo, who tended the coat room at Vincent's private club, later mentioned to Tony in passing that the Moretti family treasured lineage like currency. Tony reported the detail with a shrug that meant nothing until it meant everything. Detective Ramirez began to ask casual questions, not knowing yet that his curiosity would soon turn into a file. Maida started keeping a small recorder hidden in the hem of her uniform, collecting snippets of orders and names. It was in these collected fragments that evidence began to appear. She found, on a napkin left in her pocket, a receipt for a wire transfer from a shell company to a clinic on the riverside with timestamps that did not line up with known business hours. It was not proof enough to break a system, but it was a start. The technical work of assembling the crumbs required attention to detail. Maya and Sophia sat over a laptop in a narrow living room with the hum of a radiator and the smell of instant coffee. They exported metadata from a found pen drive and compared timestamps to surveillance logs. The forensics were small but precise. File creation dates showed manual tampering. Bank transfer logs, when matched to SMS notifications, revealed patterns of movement that suggested payoffs timed with municipal votes. The language of evidence was dry and slow to reveal malice. They cataloged screenshots, labeled them, and encrypted a folder with a password. Only Sophia knew. The process demanded care and secrecy, and felt, for both women, like learning to load a life-size gun. They rehearsed questions for a lawyer and made a list of people to trust. The plan to confront the truth evolved into a night at a neutral warehouse by the river, where crates smelled of salt and old cardboard, and the city leaned in with distant horns. The lead-up to that confrontation contained 2 long moments of tension that shaped the moral core of the story. In the first, Maya sat in a parked car while Luca paced across the street, and a man in a beanie watched the doorway of the restaurant. Her hands moved through the steering wheel, remembering language. She replayed the memory of a child's hand taught to make the sign for home. Fear made her hands clever. She considered running, and then thought of the faces who would be left to restart alone. In the second moment, inside the warehouse, evidence lay on a folding table under a single lamp. The air tasted metallic, and the sound of dripping water kept time. Vincent arrived with a retinue who carried calm as armor. Detective Ramirez stood at the edge like a man between 2 worlds. The first exchange was about the paper, then moved to consequence. Voices rose and lowered with the rhythm of bargaining. Someone accused, someone denied, and in the pause before action, it felt like the city held its breath. The confrontation itself unfolded quickly and then slowly in memory. Rosa stepped forward and signed, not for show, but with a clarity that cut across any arranged silence. Her hands made meanings that bypassed Vincent and landed on the room in a way that made some people bend and others straighten. The surprise was not that she could sign, but that she used it to deliver a truth that mattered more than pride. "We were small," she said, in a voice that shook like a lamp. "We made choices." The evidence on the table contained ledgers and recordings that tied the Moretti political donors to transfers intended to silence a neighborhood clinic. Vincent had expected loyalty and received instead the slow unspooling of history. In that tension, the real decision was moral, not pragmatic. Would Vincent protect the family name by burying facts, or let an admission shift the ledger? What followed were consequences precise enough to feel like weather. Arrests were not cinematic, and they were not many. Some transactions were reversed quietly. A municipal contract was reviewed by a procedural board. The community that had been paid in small denials began to speak with louder mouths. Maya did not become safe overnight. She had to navigate new exposures and the bitter taste of attention. But the ledger of her life changed. 1 month after the warehouse meeting, she worked a different shift, and Rosa attended a community soup kitchen that Sophia helped run. A small article. A local paper mentioned irregularities tied to an influential family and used words like inquiry and review. Marco organized a shift to cover Maya when she met with a lawyer. Elena brought a thermos of coffee. Detective Ramirez called to check on her welfare and dropped an envelope with a subpoena that asked only for her statement. 3 months later, the word among neighbors was that the clinic had received a cleansing audit and a new grant application was under review. Community activists like Sophia and a lawyer named Helen, who had taken an interest in the case, held a town meeting in a church basement that smelled of bleach and lemon. People named names and spoke of hidden fees and how they had been told to be grateful for crumbs. The restaurant instituted a policy of hiring interpreters for staff and posted a sign that read, "Support for accessibility." Maya walked into work with the knowledge that her hands could connect people, and that connection mattered politically and humanly. Vincent maintained his position, but began to avoid certain nights. He sent a younger cousin named Paulo to smooth relations with the board and promised a donation that would be scrutinized. The civic ledger had shifted. Small practices that had permitted stealth payments were beginning to take sunlight. 6 months later, Maya had a new rhythm. She visited her mother with more frequency and sometimes brought dishes for an evening with the old square. The shelter where Sophia volunteered received more volunteers and a modest grant, and people who once walked past the clinic now stopped in for blood pressure checks. Rosa came to the restaurant on a quiet afternoon and sat at a corner table where the sun made mosaics in the wood. She signed across the table and taught the kitchen a slow dish that smelled of tomatoes and basil. Vincent continued to attend certain events, but with a visible hedging of openness that allowed him to keep power while conceding small truths. The community had not been saved in a single strike, but had been rearranged in increments that mattered. Maya sometimes still tasted espresso and fear together, but more often she tasted gratitude and the brittle sweetness of a life remade. If this story moved you, share where you are watching from and which choice you would have made. If you want more stories that examine how ordinary people collide with systems of power and find ways to respond, subscribe and stay with us. Remember that sometimes the smallest language, the one you share with your hands, can change the course of a life and maybe of a neighborhood.